Hey there. Welcome to the Pelvis Project podcast. I'm Megan.
And I'm Roxy. We're two pelvic health experts brought together by passion for our careers, entrepreneurship, motherhood, and the desire for intentional relationships.
Join us in our mission to spread pelvic floor awareness and start conversations surrounding the truth behind genuine health, imperfect wellness, and joyfully navigating life. We are so glad you are here with us.
Let's start the conversation. Hello again. We are back. Hey, Megan.
Good morning. Well, today we're coming at you in the morning instead of
Rise
10
and
o'clock at
shine.
night. Yeah, it's the sun's out. And this is kind of fun that I am recording. This is a first for me, recording this podcast in my car, all in the name of making it to a kid's field trip on time.
That is dedication. I love it. Well, we have a fun treat for you today, but before we jump into that, we're going to do our Tell Me Something Good. Megan, do you want to start or do you want me to start?
Let's see. I saw something the other day that said, it was something along the lines of, like, if you can make it to your kids' events or something like along those lines, then you're making it. And it wasn't like events, but, like being able to show up for like weekend tournaments and all that kind of stuff. And it gave me good perspective. And so I'm just really thankful. And something good today is that I'm able to have a day of flexibility where I am doing more admin work and able to come to a field trip, because that wasn't always my story with my career. And that technology allows me to record a podcast in my car and that. So that's my Tell Me Something Good.
I like it. Well, we are kind of, I guess, starting into the thick of all the Christmas stuff. So this weekend was really sweet. We got to connect with my grandma, my aunts and uncles and cousins and whatnot. And my grandma is just such a sweetie, but she's getting older. She's in her 90s. And so I think it was just one of those like reflective times of to say, man, like she's just lived a really rich life. And, every time we get to see her, get to be with her longer, it's just still a blessing, So I think just even appreciating some of, I don't know, like thinking, okay, what do I want to be when I'm at that point in my grandkids, like kind of like legacy. I don't know. I'm not trying to get super deep here, but just thinking through, I think it's just a good reminder when you're just around people that you appreciate and you enjoy and thinking, this is like, what do I want to do? How do I want to be and whatnot? So anyway, that's my Tell Me Something Good.
Hey.
Well, I'm going to introduce, we're going to have a guest speaker this morning. We're going to switch it up a little bit on you. We've had guest speakers in the past, and we have one today that we're excited about. So we are going to be chatting here with Maureen Francois. She is the co-owner and founder of Wild Hope Counseling Therapy Practice, and they have locations in Salina, Kansas, and Kansas City. We're going to let her kind of introduce herself more, but she has specialized training in maternal and mental health. But she treats a lot of people from just a variety of different backgrounds and socioeconomic statuses and family dynamics. She has a lot of experience in anxiety, depression, trauma, and specialized training in things like CBT, EMDR, and is a registered play therapist. So we'll let her introduce herself a little bit more, but we are so excited to have her on with us today. Well, Maureen, welcome. We're happy to have you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here.
Well, this morning, let's just start off. Do you mind just introducing yourself and letting us kind of know your background, your history, who you are, where you're from, what you love, people in your life that you want to share about, anything that's just like personal so we kind of know who we're talking to here?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a therapist located in Salina, but that's like where I am now. And I guess my journey in therapy started in Kansas City. I worked at a nonprofit in Kansas City doing in-home therapy with maternal mental health. And so that's kind of where my love for maternal mental health was planted there. And then after that, two colleagues and I, Stevie and Jessica, we are both the owners, or we're all the owners of Wild Hope. We started Wild Hope because we just saw that there was such a need for maternal mental health. And then as our families were growing, we just really found that a private practice aligned more. with our personal lifestyles. And then from that, each of us have kind of created other niches within that. Some of my areas of focus are one, maternal mental health, trauma, as well as I'm a play therapist. And yeah.
I love that.
Yeah, a lot.
Yeah, you hit a lot of things. What does it look like to do in-home therapy for maternal mental health?
Yeah. There's so much value in it, I think, too. Like in an initial assessment, like you're asking so many questions about their home life. Well, when you're in someone's home, there's some of those questions that are already given to you, just being in their space. And a lot of the families we were working with were low income. So if we weren't able to go to their home, they were not able to access therapy, which was a huge gift to be able to offer that for them.
That's cool. I just haven't heard of that. I think that's neat. That's rich. That's like an interesting idea and strategy to reach people. I like that.
Yeah.
I know we like jumped in with our question there about what that looked like.
Sorry. I just
I know we were like, okay, so yeah. So you guys opened your practice, and is your partner or one of your partners in Kansas City then?
So we have a location in the Prairie Village area in Kansas City.
Okay.
And we started, gosh, time is weird. I'm like, okay, I think we started about 6 years ago. Wild Hope. And then 2 years ago, my oldest daughter was starting kindergarten. And so for our family, moving closer to family just really aligned with our family values and where we were wanting to be. And so it's been so awesome to be in Salina. That I grew up in Salina. And so to be here, to give back to a community that gave me so much, and then also to help kind of fill some of the mental health gaps that I do see. And even I don't really view Salina as rural, but like from a mental health standpoint, I think there are some maybe areas that are like lacking, or even accessibility and different things like that too.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, we had some mentors that we left one time because I think they think when we're in Kansas that we're all rural.
Exactly.
But yeah, I mean, and like you said, in like Salina, I mean, it's just continuing to grow. But yeah, you're right. I mean, having access and somewhat of like, compared to Kansas City and Wichita and cities like that are somewhat larger, and for people to have choices is, super important. So that's awesome.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And also, like Salina, what I've seen from a mental health perspective is it's a hub for other areas in the surrounding communities to really access to.
Yeah.
So with more specialized training, such as like EMDR for trauma, for play therapy, and then even maternal mental health, like to be able to kind of serve that, or to be able to meet those specific needs with specialized care, I think I've loved it. And I think it's been also a huge need for the community.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, since we are in the pelvic health world, your specialty of like the maternal mental health is something that really we wanted to really dive into that part. We think all of that's awesome. So definitely, I don't want to negate any of that, but I want to just ask you, tell us a little bit about what that looks like, or what you're seeing on the mental health side. We see in therapy, like we in pelvic health therapy, we see, the overwhelm, or we're seeing the physical symptoms, and we're seeing a lot of the questions or the uncertainties or things like that we aren't trained to work with. And so we're looking for people like you. But I think just if you want to give us kind of what you see, what the big needs are, what the trends are in that specific population, I think that'd be really valuable to dive in and kind of chat more about that.
So the two things like in that really stand out to me are I think in a lot of ways, like motherhood is such a beautiful thing. And in our society, it is glorified in the sense of like, oh, you should be able to do it all. Like you should be able to handle it all. Like probably you don't need any help with anything. And then, and I think that's what our society kind of tells us. And then when a new mom gets into that role of a mother for the first time, she's like, ooh, this is a lot harder than I thought. Or like, maybe I do need support, or people didn't tell me about this side of motherhood. And I think there's a little more transparency coming out about like, hey, let's talk about the hard parts and the beautiful parts of motherhood. But I think really just knowing like, even in times where you feel alone, there is support that can help you. And going into motherhood with that lens. So I love when I start with a client prenatal, because then one, they have, oh, yes, I saw your smiles, because I'm like, I bet you guys feel the same way.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes.
And I think one thing I see is like that prenatal phase, if we're able to even establish a positive therapeutic relationship, then in those weeks after birth, if the birth went as planned or there were some unexpected things in that, then our clients are not having to think of, well, where do I start and how do I establish care with somebody? So I think that's super valuable in that too. And then the other thing, as you were asking, that was coming up for me, is really having a collaborative relationship with other providers. So like when you were saying, like, I love having relationships with pelvic floor therapists, with dietitians, with OBs in the community, different things like that. Because then I think it's like we're all working together, while also I want to stay in my lane because that's what I know how to do. And how can I find a great PT to then help you with the postpartum physical?
Oh, so many things with that. I know, Roxy, you probably too. Like, I love, yeah, like how, we highly recommend seeing somebody more in that prenatal time too, because you're establishing a relationship. And like you said, then you're not, I would just remember back when I had my kiddos that are 10 and 13, I wasn't a pelvic floor therapist and all of this wasn't talked about as much. And I think in that time, in those first weeks where if I needed something, I was so tired. I had no idea. I was overwhelmed. I would have known where to start. And so when you've already established a relationship with a provider before you've had this big life event, you already have that support system started. And so, yeah, just thinking about what you said for even in your area of, and I never even thought about that, but yeah, it's just as important to, if not more, because then you're ready. And also too, like you're able to know and establish how, I think big life events are always just so impactful. And so to kind of know how somebody processed prior and then what's happening after is probably very helpful.
Yes, absolutely. And, I think even if like sometimes you'll hear, well, maybe I'll just access it when I need it.
Yeah.
However, I think obviously I'm going to be biased about this, but in my opinion, even if you establish a therapeutic relationship and you only tap in and utilize that relationship as self-care,
Yes.
there's not going to be harm in that. Even if you don't have postpartum anxiety and postpartum depression, then you okay, like whether you continue that, whether you have a safe place to fall, if some other life situation comes up too. So really just echoing exactly what you said of like, seems like a win-win, right? Like to establish care in those areas where maybe you have a little bit more capacity, even though it doesn't feel like you have more capacity to access those things, can serve like you, your family, your husband so well in those situations.
Yeah. And I don't know. I think that I was sitting with this the other day in our profession, that physical therapy used to be looked at as you only go when you have a problem. And I know for Roxy and I both in the settings that we're in now, I mean, we are definitely tables are turning, and you're probably seeing that too, of like, you can go with the thought of this is self-care, it's preventative care, it's to support wellness. Nothing has to be necessarily quote unquote wrong to get started and just have that support. And like you said, if you stumble, that somebody's there. And so I love like even thinking about that too, because I think for mental health as well, there for a while, it's like, well, you only go see a therapist if you have a problem, like you're anxious or whatever. And now, I mean, I know with my therapist that I see, it started as one thing, delayed postpartum anxiety. And now I've seen her for years. And it's sometimes just professional development discussions, like, and I will not stop.
That's awesome. Yeah. What I talk with a lot of clients about is like in those moments where actually you're feeling better, maybe sometimes that's the time to even amp up or to strengthen some of the coping or think about them in a different way.
I love
So
that.
then we're not like reactive, but we're really just being like, okay, we've prepared for this. We've done some thought restructuring around this. We know what behaviors can help us. We processed through that trauma, whatever it is. But then that can really, like, really sometimes that's where even more progress happens in those moments where you're more regulated too. And what I also, in a lot of the women I work with, even if we reach where it's like, hey, you know what? I don't think we need that frequency, as often. But let's look at like monthly, every 6 weeks, something like that, just so you have a neutral space to then be able to process or really, again, that therapy is self-care to life, like you were saying, Megan.
What, like if someone calls you, because I know how I feel like that was me starting my therapy journey was like, I see there could be trouble on the horizon, or I want to prevent trouble on the horizon. Do you find that women struggle to do that? Or is that like an awkward first session? Not necessarily for you, but like what are things that maybe are keeping women from doing that you've noticed trends about, or things that they're like, I don't really know what I'm supposed to talk about? Or I don't know. Do you sense that insecurity of being proactive and feeling like with the stigma of usually people think we go to therapy for when something's wrong?
Yeah. The first thing that came to mind is a negative previous experience with therapy.
Mhm.
Or I had to do it, or someone told me I had to do it, or it was a bad fit. And that happens. Like I tell everyone our first session, I'm like, I'm a great fit for some people and I'm not for others. But what I do care about is finding a fit that is right for you. And I mean that from like the bottom of my heart. I'm like, I want to connect you with the support that you need. And I think that really just gives permission to say like, hey, it's not a good fit, or hey, it is. And you're not stuck too in that like therapeutic relationship. Sometimes I think we're looking for the right time. So like, I want to wait until, or it will be better when. And I'm a huge advocate of early intervention across the board with adults, with children. Like the earlier we're able to slowly surface that in a way that feels good, and then we can see change happen faster too.
That's so good.
Yes.
There's like so many
I have so
things
many
in that
thoughts.
statement.
I know I'm sitting here quietly because I'm like processing because there was something you said that I'm like, oh, yes, absolutely.
I guess I think about that I don't know. This is going to maybe go off on the wrong way, and that's okay. But I'm just thinking about that. If that was the mindset, like how do we shift that culture? Because I think if that was the mindset in mental health, and obviously we're biased to pelvic health, right? But even just like in health in general or relationships, or I don't know, like from a therapy standpoint, where do you see culture shift or narrative shift around this part of life? Again, where people are saying, well, it's not bad yet, or like, let me wait until this, or just in your world? Because I think we struggle with that too of, man, if we could have seen that person before, this would have been easier. What have you seen, or have you felt like has been successful, or what are things we can be doing to shift that? I think is maybe just I'm
Yeah.
seeing a bigger problem, not just in your world, not just in our world of health, but just in a bigger preventative maintenance type of mentality. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes. And the first word that, like, when you were asking that question, that was coming up is comparison. And I think women are so vulnerable to comparison in so many ways. Like, systemically, we don't set ourselves up. Like, it doesn't set us up for success in comparison. Then I think of like social media. What are we consuming? How are we looking at those different things? Like, so that was the thing that I really thought about of like, okay, we're in this environment where comparison is just around us, which then we perceive someone else's experience as nothing's wrong, which I think then our narrative to ourselves is something's wrong with me. Then within that, there's fear of reaching out for help. There's feeling alone. How will this impact my relationship? How will this impact my job? Is this going to be too much? Can I handle what I am like knowing's there, but kind of avoiding? So anyway, like all of that to then look at like, how do we start to make that a part of our everyday conversation?
Yeah.
So I think the next piece that's coming to mind for me is working collaboratively with other providers. So how am I assessing for the physical part and feeling really confident and saying like, hey, let me give you a referral to someone who can help with that? How are we assessing for the mental health, nutrition, relationships, all of that? Getting really comfortable with conversations that are uncomfortable, both professionally and then also within our personal lives too. The chances are of like other people probably feel alone too, or have felt like they're not a great mom, or how are they ever going to do this with another child, or like different kind of thoughts like that. I hope that makes sense.
Yes.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah. Getting comfortable with uncomfortable conversations. Like, I think I don't know. That just seems like I don't know. I feel like you just diagnosed the world. I don't know. As far as
Yeah.
just, relationships and confrontation and even belief systems. And I don't know, like if we just look at that idea across a lot of different, I don't know, topics or fields or circumstances or situations, I think, man, to exercise that and to be comfortable with ourselves to then step into an uncomfortable conversation and still be able to hold our ground. And I think even in a professional standpoint to say, man, I think you need this, not necessarily in that verbiage, but just saying, I think this could be really helpful and being confident in that. I think that has like convicted me a little bit just to really be more confident in an uncomfortable situation or like even with a patient to say, man, that sounds like you could someone could be really helpful for you with that. Or I don't know, like I'm just kind of thinking out loud as far as myself doing that. That's a big ask and not a big ask, but that's just a tall order that is really healthy though.
Yeah, it made me think about, I know early in my career before I got into pelvic health, I don't think I ever even thought to have the conversation with anybody about if they needed to see mental health therapy because my setting I was in as a PT that just didn't come up. And so then when I got into pelvic health, I recognized that there's a layer there that we have to address. And I remember being uncomfortable. Like, are they going to think I'm saying XYZ about them if I'm suggesting therapy, And now I'm way more comfortable with it. And often it's brought up very early on because it is such an important aspect of what we do. And so when you're talking about, like that uncomfortable conversation, I have noticed that we've got lots of great providers, but I think sometimes even in like our regular GP office that there might be some discomfort of maybe it's a male provider to a female. And there's some really important conversations being missed because of potential, like, don't want to make somebody feel uncomfortable. So that definitely, when you were talking about that, I have sensed that. And there was, there was something else too. There was something else you said that I was like, yes. I'm going to go back and listen to this episode myself.
The piece you were saying about like, in our physicians' offices, I was in a conversation once with a physician and this like shed great light for me of like in medicine, or they're trying to prevent the problem, not looking for a problem. And so sometimes I think like, oh, well, if they're not telling me,
Yes.
that like he was sharing this with me, like if they're not telling me, then I'm not going to look for it. I was like, okay, that gives really good insight
Yeah.
for me of like, okay, what's your modality in approaching mental health? And how can I equip my clients to advocate for themselves in that too? Knowing like this might not always be asked of you. And like, how can you ask for what you need to
Yeah.
kind of in that or giving yourself permission? I think a lot of times in prenatal and postpartum, like those visits go so fast. So you don't even know, like, oh, I can ask a question. Like, that's
Yeah.
okay in
Yeah.
this. Like, so really just slowing that down and then equipping people with like, hey, have you ever thought about asking this? And oh my gosh, no. Like, that's
Yeah.
really great. Like, let's ask in some of that too.
Well, and I think I remember now where I was the other layer of what you were mentioning previously, but that comparison factor, I think that definitely crosses over into this conversation with providers, because if the comparison is, oh, this person seems like they have it all together, and we're not talking more about what's actually going on, then even us as patients walking in there, I mean, we see this all the time. They don't even know what to ask or even to bring it up because they don't know that it's not normal, because they think it's normal just because everybody else is continuing like it's normal. And so then we have a layer of, you don't even know that you should say something. I mean, we see that with like painful intercourse. If someone's always had pain with sex, they don't even know that it's not normal. They just think that's them. So that was kind of that where I was like, yes, this is because I see it every day. And I just did this local women's leadership cohort, and it was a group of 30 women. And that was like one of my biggest realizations, which I knew, but to be in a room with that many women and realize that even though some of these women are like high executives at companies and some of us own businesses and all these different like dynamic women, the majority of us all had the commonality of the same insecurities and the same concerns. And when you realize that, like, I remember the day that I was like, oh, I can completely be vulnerable here and just let down my guard, because I'm realizing like we all are this way. And if you're acting like you don't deal with any of this, that just builds more anxiety because you have to present yourself like you have everything together and you don't.
Yes, I love the way that you said that. I think that's so true. And when there are those little moments that like, oh, we care so much in this, then it's like so much more conversation or even connection, like in a relationship,
Yes.
can happen.
Yes. Roxy, anything to that?
I'm just soaking this in because I love it.
I know. I'm literally like, I can't wait to listen again. And I'm sitting here thinking, okay, we are going to need a part 2 of this.
Oh, I'm honored. I would love a part 2.
Well, because I think there's so many, well, we had mentioned prior to, I don't know, we were on our intro. Well, actually, I think we were off recording. So for our listeners, we were talking about play therapy, and both of our kids, Roxy's daughter and my son, do play therapy. And so I think there's even a level of this when we talk about, our mamas and then that aspect with our kids and the comparison, and like if things aren't going easy at home, and what does easy mean? And so again, there's just more layers into this as you are seeing women in motherhood and in the thick of it. But I think the one line that has stuck with me through this whole conversation, and it almost makes me want to get teary, is the phrase, "It'll get better when."
Mm.
And I think that I've lived that. I live it right now. And I hear my patients say it all the time. And it just kind of has started to make my heart kind of like, oh, because no, like let's do it now.
Yeah. When I hear you say that too, like I think there's this mentality around like the thing approach. So like
Yeah.
this will be the thing that changes everything.
Yes.
And like the reality is that's not a reality. Like that is not the reality. And there's so many little things that can make those changes happen, but it's not one thing. So like if we're approaching therapy saying like, this is the thing that's going to change every relationship in my life, that's not going to happen. It's those little moments in our sessions or the little discoveries we make along the way that can tweak and change how you advocate for yourself in relationships, how you feel connected in relationships, if there's conversations that need to be had. And so I think like in life, though, like speaking to what you said of like, when we have like, it'll be better when, or it's this thing that's going to make me happy, or it's going to make my family get along better. Like it really is a lot of little things that make those big changes happen.
Yeah.
And it takes time and it takes energy and work to do them. And in therapy, we try to do it in a way of like, okay, how can we do these little things to build your resources, build your coping, to then know like, how can I practically implement these things on my day-to-day basis? That then we start to see my mood shift, my thought shift, all of those things around it too.
Gosh.
Yeah.
I think it just reminds me too, I just think there's a lot of parallel between physical health and mental health, but just like you said, of it's the little things. And I don't know how many times I feel like I tell my patients, this isn't jazzy, like this isn't sparkly and pretty, like it's a process and it's kind of monotonous sometimes or boring. And it's not like these big events that are going to happen. And the work isn't super fun and you're not bragging about all these cool things that are happening. And like, I mean, when we meet the goals, when we see like progress, that is exciting. But just like you said, it's like these little moments, it's these little times. It's work, it's repetition, it's a process, and embracing that a little bit is the beauty of it. But I just think about how often we want it to be jazzy and sparkly and cool and exciting, and it's often not.
It takes work. Yeah. Well, I think we still have a little bit of time here, but maybe talk to us a little bit about, I think we have a lot of people that have a lot of questions about EMDR and kind of like, what is that? What can that help me with? So share a little bit with us about kind of what that is and kind of a little bit of an overview of what that looks like for someone.
Yes. Okay. So EMDR is a great modality for trauma. So really looking at reprocessing traumatic event. So how I like to explain it is we have one step in the past and one step in the future. And what we're looking to do is access and activate different maybe moments of trauma while also not reliving the trauma. Absolutely not what we're doing, but what we're doing is looking at like, okay, how do we access and activate that to then reprocess it and then to help the intensity or the disturbance of that situation be less. So maybe in a situation of birth trauma, it's like, I just keep thinking about this part of my birth. I should have said this different. I should have done this different. So maybe we would look at that, kind of go through that, and then be able to help make the intensity of that experience less. So I'm thinking of a specific client who had a traumatic birth. Her child was delivered early, unexpectedly in the NICU, and was really what she was seeing was postpartum depression. But through our work together, we did EMDR, and then he was like, wow, like being able to really slow down that experience through EMDR helped the disturbance of thinking about her son's birth be a lot less. So another example like with that would be sometimes like maybe being activated by a smell or something, like a smell, or going back to your OB's office or different things like that, like surfacing those things or not realizing that those were a trigger. And then that gives us something to work with from there. I also feel like I need to explain like how the process works. So it's through what I'm using technical terms, which is how I explain it to my clients, because I also think it's important to understand kind of the pieces of some of it. But the thing we're doing is called dual attention stimulation. So through that, we either do eye movement, tapping, or there's these buzzers that clients can hold, and through that process. So how this whole modality was created was they were walking through the forest, moving their eyes back and forth, looking at the different things around them, thinking of this event, a previous traumatic event, and realizing after they did that their disturbance level was less. So that's kind of how it was all created. And then, so the idea is then when we're stimulating our brain in these ways, that we're able to rewire the experience of our brain in that situation in a controlled, safe environment.
It's awesome. I mean, I think just, hopefully that's really powerful for a lot of people to actually hear, because there's probably so many situations where our, mamas don't even realize that maybe like the smell of walking into the OB's office, or there's something about and they don't know why they're so uncomfortable. Like, what is that? To know that like that can happen, and there are things that can be done to help with that. So yeah, I feel like there could even, again, another whole conversation on EMDR.
Maureen, will you say how severe, or how do you know that this is appropriate for you? Right? Because I'm thinking back to like just things that have happened in my life that to me were like, I wouldn't even call them traumatic, but they've kind of shaped how I respond to things now. Right. But like EMDR probably, like, when is it appropriate? When is it not? I think I'm just the curiosity of the spectrum of how do you know, like, this would be really good, or I should look for this treatment or seek that out.
It's hard to give like an exact answer to that because I think it's so individualized. One thing that I think could maybe help answer to a broad sense of that is like, if you notice you're thinking about it, or it's disturbing you, or it's popping into your mind, or you're like, oh, there's a reason I just did that, and that's tied to this situation. Even if maybe like your comparison, right? Like you're comparing it to someone else's situation, and you're like, oh, but I don't think that would be traumatic enough. But from an individualized standpoint, if it's something that's bothering you, if it's popping into your mind a lot about a certain situation, I mean, it could be worth exploring. The other thing I was thinking of too is how our body stores information, which I'm sure you guys see often. So within that, we're really looking at like, okay, are you experiencing tension, any like bodily sensations throughout that too? Because that can be another really powerful way to rewire some of those experiences, or notice like, ooh, like maybe it could go either way. Like maybe I feel the sensation in my body and then I realize some thoughts that are around that, or maybe it's vice versa. I have these thoughts and then like, oh, I never noticed I was storing this tension in those different places.
So good. Oh, there's so many things. I'm like, oh man, I even know that as you were talking about, Roxy, how you said it's like, how do you know like when, it's appropriate, or, there's things that's happened in your life. And I know my dad had gone through this like health event, and we were in the hospital for a very long time. And so the IVs beeping and the smell of the hospital and all that stuff, like it was a very kind of traumatic time. It's very scary. And this was like years later, I went to my functional medicine doctor to go get like a vitamin C IV in their like thing. Didn't even think about it. Like got in the recliner. They hooked me up. I didn't realize I was going to be in like a room with like a bank of IVs, and I could hear everybody's IV. And I was like, I need to get out of here.
Yes. Your
that
body
was one of those
remembers.
moments where I was like, yeah. So so that just like knowing how that can happen with, so when you think about, and we're talking about like maternal medicine and that sort of thing, of how traumatic and it's also when it's your child and your baby is involved. And I think just talking about it more, like you said, I mean, getting women to know that we don't have to like strong arm this. We don't have to be like, it'll get better when, and we don't have to, just suffer through. Like there are resources and I mean, things like this that can be so incredibly helpful. So I'm hoping that we're getting a lot of people listening that can take away like, okay, it's time to make the call.
Maureen, no, I was just going to ask if you had anything, like any kind of final thoughts or encouragement for people, or just kind of a little, not to put you on the spot or pressure you or anything, but just like a little concluding statement of just what you're seeing, or how you would want to leave this conversation, what note you want to kind of end on here.
Yes. So I feel like to kind of summarize our conversation is just for people to know that they're not alone, and then there is help there. If you've accessed therapeutic help that wasn't a good fit, I would encourage you to try again. And I'd be happy to connect you. There's also do like a vibe check. Like if you're like something's off, go into your first appointment and know that you don't have to commit forever. And I think that would be like, if you're thinking about it, I think that's a really good cue to you that like, hey, this is maybe something you should do.
Yeah.
Like
the
that.
thoughts crossed your mind, just do it.
Exactly.
And I think that what you said is so powerful. And just because you've tried it before and it didn't work doesn't mean that it's not going to work. It might just be that it wasn't the right vibe or provider. And we echo that 100% because we hear that all the time in our field of like, well, I've tried pelvic floor PT and it didn't work. And it was like, well, I would really highly recommend you give it a go again, because it could be that it wasn't the right provider, or again, maybe you didn't connect, and that's just so important. So we just thank you so much for talking with us this morning. And I definitely think we need to have a conversation about a part 2. And we'll have all your information in the show notes so people know how they can reach out to you and follow both your offices. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, we are just so thankful to be able to have this conversation with Maureen, and we just hope that everybody was able to take away something from this conversation. We'll leave some details of her information in the show notes, and if you have any questions, I'm sure she's open to you shooting her a DM or an Instagram message, and we're just thankful to be able to have these guests and share this knowledge. Until next time, continue the conversation. Thank you so much for joining us this week on the Pelvis Project podcast. Help us continue the conversation by liking and sharing this episode with friends. And if you really want to do us a solid, leave us a review. If you'd like to follow us on social, check out the show notes for links. And remember, this week, take a deep breath and relax your pelvic floor.